Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and children of all ages, it's time to play the tabletop role-playing games world's most popular game show. It's Wheel of Irrelevance, and today's topic is a new one. Ding! Dragonlance, the award-winning, multi-printed, amazing fantasy storyline by our friends Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. Dragonlance, which defined much of the late 80s fantasy genre. Dragonlance is the topic of this week and last week's controversial arguments that is tearing the tabletop role-playing game community apart. You are either in, I guess there's 4 teams, 2 teams, and maybe each, I don't know. So basically the argument breaks down to either Dragonlance is the best thing that happened to the tabletop role-playing game / Dungeons & Dragons hobby in the late 80s, early 90s, or Dragonlance is the worst thing that happened to the tabletop role-playing game hobby in the late 80s and early 90s. And then, is Dragonlance D&D or not? Are you confused? Does that make your brain hurt? It makes my brain hurt. So is it one and the same or 2 different? I don't know. If you're not familiar with Dragonlance, I don't even know how to begin to explain it to you. It is such an amazing phenomenon. And it's kind of one of those things where you sort of had to be there to really appreciate what Dragonlance was and did for the hobby in the late 80s. But yeah, it's a fantasy book series by our friends Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. It takes place in a fantasy world. It's, got all its heroes, villains, magic. It's, if you read it without knowing D&D, you'd be like, okay, this is cool. If you read it and knew about D&D, you'd be like, wait, this seems a lot like D&D, but just reskinned. So did the campaign come first and then the books and then the TSR shit? Or did the books come first and then the campaign and the TSR shit? I don't know. Only Margaret and Tracy know the actual timeline. But the book series was converted to a D&D series. It was incredibly popular. It brought a lot of people to the table in the late 80s because of Dragonlance. So the cross-pollination of which one came first is kind of muddled, but it was there. It was a thing, and it was a really big thing for a while. So was Dragonlance the best thing that happened to D&D in the late 80s or the worst thing that happened to D&D in the late 80s? Yes. I mean, best in that it brought new people to the table, right? People who might not have other played D&D and during that time period, but had read the books or heard about the books and were very excited about the world of the books and wanted to take that and saw this thing, this phenomenon that allowed you to take this amazing world of literature and in your head and play it out on the table. So it brought a lot of people to the table who might not have otherwise come to the table during that time period, and especially for a lot of us, girls. Oh my God, there's a girl playing D&D with us. And that was, we remember what it was like having girls at the table in the 80s, don't we, boys? So yeah, that's good. It brought new money. It brought new awareness. It brought new people to the hobby. And generally, unlike another phenomenon, the people that it brought to the hobby were generally cool and appreciated the hobby and understood that what they saw in the book and what they saw in the game were not the same. But then a setting book was made using the D&D rules at the time, and then it got even more muddled. Because we get to the next thing. Is Dragonlance D&D or is it not D&D? Now, some would argue Dragonlance and D&D is the same thing. You wouldn't have 80s D&D, early 90s D&D without Dragonlance, and you wouldn't have 80s, early 90s Dragonlance without D&D. And Dragonlance became part and parcel, one and the same with D&D. And you can't run Dragonlance in any other system other than D&D 1980s / 1990s. If you tried to run it today in 5e, it doesn't work. If you tried to run it today in GURPS, it doesn't work. It only works in D&D then. Now, if you've stuck with me for these first 5 minutes, you realize this argument is dumb and pointless and makes no sense. And it is building up a war over a non-topic using very fallible information and facts based upon memories of things that happened in the late 80s and early 90s. And most of the people arguing this, are in their 50s now. So why are you arguing something that happened in the late 80s, early 90s, other than the fact you need something to argue about, right? Okay, so I don't even know how to break this down, but we're going to try because I've already wasted 5 minutes, right? So Dragonlance is a setting. It is unique to itself. It's existed. We got Margaret and Tracy's stuff that became Dragonlance. So we have that setting. Then Margaret and Tracy turned that setting into a series of books and other things. Okay. So that is bubble number 1. It is a setting. So it exists without D&D. Now, obviously, there are aspects of Margaret and Tracy's D&D life that led to the creation of Dragonlance. And there are obviously things in Dragonlance that are parallel to D&D. I mean, Takesha, Tiamat, Fizbin, Bahamut, dragons, magic, that whole thing, right? But it is also things that are very unique that took from other places besides D&D, medieval cultures, and the whole thing that whatever was affecting Margaret and Tracy's involvement. There are people who are far, far smarter than I am who have gone in deeply into the origins of it, and that really doesn't matter. We just know it exists, and it exists in this bubble. So it is not D&D, and it is D&D because it's a setting. And that setting just happened to be using the D&D rules at the time. Now, moving forward, the problem with Dragonlance D&D is the same problem that every role-playing game has with splat books and supplement books. And that barrier of whether I allow things from the supplement into my game or not. Okay, so D&D is Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, Dungeon Master's Guide. That is it. That's what constitutes Dungeons & Dragons. Anything else is optional supplements. And just because the company prints it does not automatically mean it becomes 100% canon to the game. So that is where the "it ruined D&D" came from. That mentality that, well, this is out and D&D is out, so everything in this book must be okay in core D&D, which leads basically to Kenders. Kenders ruin D&D, right? I think that's the real villain in this whole argument is that people generally hated Kenders and generally hated the way people ran Kenders, and that ruined D&D because they couldn't make the difference. Just because there was a D&D supplement using Dragonlance as a setting didn't mean you automatically had to allow it in your game. Now, I played in a very long D&D campaign that had no connection to Kryn/Dragonlance whatsoever, and yet there was frickin' Kenders in it. And having a Kender in that universe made no sense. But there was a Kender in it. There was 2 or 3 different people who played Kenders. Whenever they played, they just, turned it into the silly madcap nonsense because that's the way people perceived Kenders because they didn't really understand it. They were just these goofball thieves. It's like, no, did you read the book? But that was the thing. It's in a book, therefore it must be something I can use in the game. When no, it's a setting. There's nothing saying that it has to be used in your game. You can choose to allow stuff from that in your game or choose not to. And in that case, the DM should definitely have chosen not to allow them to use Kenders. So that's where your argument comes from. It's the same argument with splat books for any other, including 5e. 5e D&D is the 2014 Player's Handbook, the 2014 Monster Manual, and the 2014 DM's Guide. That is 5e core. Everything else are optional supplements. You do not have to use Tasha's if you do not want to. There is nothing forcing you to. It is just other than the assumption that if the book exists, it must be legal in the game. The same thing happened with Pathfinder and all its splats books, 2nd edition and 3rd edition with their splat books, GURPS with all the splat books and source books. If it exists, it's legal in my game. And if it's legal in my game, it ruined my game because it allowed things from this source book into my game. But Dragonlance, the series, the source, could exist without D&D. You could use the setting in GURPS or 5e or Castles and Crusades or whatever, because you take out the D&D and it's just a fantasy setting that has its own physics that happen to have some things in it that could be vaguely related to D&D. But no, I mean, come on, dragons are everywhere. Dragons existed before D&D. So first argument, is it D&D? No. Is it not D&D? No. Is it a system that exists outside D&D? Yes. Did it ruin D&D? No. Did Kenders ruin D&D? Allowing Kenders into your game ruin D&D. Dragonlance did not ruin D&D. People assuming that because the book was printed, it 100 became set in stone things I had to allow in my game. That is what, quote unquote, ruined your game, guys. Not, Dragonlance could exist in GURPS or any other fantasy setting rule book, and it'd be perfectly the same. Sure, you'd have to change some things to make it fit the physics of the Dragonlance setting, but so did D&D change things to fit the physics of the D&D setting when they came out with the books in the late 80s. I mean, it was not the Player's Handbook as written. It had all new races and classes and character builds and histories and things like that. It was not the same, other than the fact that it used similar mechanics. And nobody said, yes, this is 100% in-game. You have to allow this in your D&D game. There has to be Kenders in your D&D game. No, nobody said that. And it's the same argument today about Dragonlance or any other setting. These are settings that exist outside the core rules. You do not have to allow them if you do not want to. They are optional. Okay, so let's just remind you to get back to the start. What is this argument about? Whether Dragonlance is or is not D&D. And the answer is it doesn't matter because it's a setting that exists outside D&D. So yes, it's D&D, and no, it's not D&D. You can use D&D without Dragonlance, and you can use Dragonlance without D&D. It exists outside of the Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, and DM's Guide. Did Dragonlance ruin Dungeons & Dragons in the 80s/early 90s? Absolutely not. Did it save Dungeons & Dragons in the early 80s and 90s? No more so than any of the other things that came out in the late 80s, early 90s. There's a lot of things that came out that brought people to the table that might not have otherwise been gaming. Dragonlance was one of them, but also we had Vampire in the late 80s, early 90s. We had GURPS in the late 80s, early 90s. We had Cyberpunk. We had Rifts. We had hundreds of other things that were bringing people to the table that might not otherwise have come to the table. Let us not forget that there was a certain period of time from 85 to 91 where GURPS was king of the castle. Nobody was playing D&D. It was GURPS as far as you could see. So yeah, it brought people to the table, but no more so than anything else. And the culture was different then. It was way more accepting than it was now. Somebody who read Dragonlance would come to the table, play D&D, and if they didn't have the Dragonlance stuff in it, they were fine because they found something to love about the game they were playing. I read Dragonlance while we're doing GURPS. What's GURPS? Oh, okay. What do I do to make a character? Oh, okay. Well, this doesn't have anything to do with Dragonlance, but it's still a great game, and I'm having a great time. I will stick with this hobby. That was the magic of that time period, as opposed to now, where, of course, it's toxic. And people are like, well, Dragonlance ruined 5e because blah, 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 blah. No. Dragonlance didn't do anything. People did things. And what ruined D&D for a lot of people in the late 80s, early 90s was the Kenders. And the idea that if it existed in Dragonlance, I have to have it in my game. And if I don't, because apparently I forgot that it's optional rules, even though it clearly says it's optional rules. The D&D is 3 books. So yes, it is part of the product line of D&D, but it could exist outside D&D. You could run Dragonlance in another system. That's what I mean, Frank. Here's a name we've never seen before. Hello, Frank, and welcome. What do you mean by is it or is not D&D? It's part of D&D, but it's not D&D. You could play Greyhawk in the late 80s, early 90s, Forgotten Realms in the 80s, early 90s. You could play a total Dragonlance campaign. You could have a game where the DM said, sure, I'll allow Kenders, and then live to regret it. You could also run Dragonlance in GURPS or any other fantasy setting. You know, you just alter the rules to fit the rules of Dragonlance. So the D&D books that came out for Dragonlance were altered to fit the physics of Dragonlance. But they weren't D&D. They were Dragonlance using the D&D rule set. And if it ruined D&D, it's probably because of the Kenders. Let's face it, right? Right, Frank? We can just ignore the first 16 minutes of this conversation and just all agree that Kenders and were just dumb and nobody understood how to play them. And people still don't understand how to play them. And any complaint you have about Dragonlance is probably really you're just complaining about Kenders, right? Can I get an amen? Okay, anyways, that's all I have to say. I think this is a dumb argument. I think we're arguing about Dragonlance because we don't have anything else to argue about. And if we don't argue about something in the tabletop role-playing game sphere every week, we feel like we don't matter. So we're finding controversies and we're finding reasons to be toxic to each other. And at this point, it's like, hey, let's shit on people who enjoy Dragonlance because I got nothing else to be upset about. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. I played Warhammer. I played so much. You know what I didn't play in the late 80s, early 90s? D&D. We knew about Dragonlance. It existed, but we were playing GURPS. And I'm sure there was probably a GURPS Dragonlance campaign that somebody ran. So, yeah. It's a thing. I'm done. My head isn't working. And this is a pointless argument, and I don't know why people are upset about Dragonlance, other than the fact you need to be upset about something. Let's be angry about something, and Wizards hasn't done anything dumb yet. So let's just be angry at each other over an IP that was relevant in the 80s. Hasbro should give Dragonlance 110% back to Margaret and Tracy and let them do whatever they want with it. And just not have it part of D&D anymore in the future, which, since there is no campaign setting for 2024 D&D. I feel like I'm blabbing now, so I should probably stop. Anyways, that's my 2 cents. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Where do you stand on the Dragonlance versus Dungeons & Dragons? Did it save D&D? Did it ruin D&D? Is it D&D? Is it not D&D? Does it fucking matter? Why do we care? Lion and Dragon is good. Don't know enough about Adventurer Conqueror's King. Love the idea of Borrow Maze, but I played through a Borrow Maze campaign that was almost 2 years long, and God, what a painful slog it was. But the idea of Borrow Maze is amazing. Now, I could say that was part of the DM that just didn't know how to tell the story of Borrow Maze, because there's so much that's going on in that dungeon that he didn't even ever touch upon. But yeah, anyways, that's a separate subject. But Frank, just for letting me know about it, Frank. And welcome to the channel, Frank. Please, if you haven't liked, saved, and subscribed, please take a moment to like, share, subscribe, buy my merch. And I'll talk to y'all later. Have a great day. And stay warm out there.